Hi team, welcome to the last of the lecture series for the AMP module. In this lecture we look at the respiratory system, which of course talks all about the lungs and associated structures. As we go through, we'll talk about each of the structures that air passes through on the way to the lungs, what it does to the air on the way through. We'll then focus on how we get air in and out of our lungs through the process of inspiration and expiration. And finally, we'll look at how we diffuse the two gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen, between the lungs and the bloodstream, and again between the bloodstream and the tissues. So let's dive in. You see a wee video there when you're watching this on the Prezi or on the Articulate presentations that I put on the Moodle page. It gives you a nice overview of the structures, but we'll go through them face to face now. These are the key structures that we need to be familiar with, guys. You'll have to locate these in your assessment at the end of topic quiz. And you can see there's a bunch of words down the bottom. And this one you can test yourself on once you've learned the structures, and we'll go to the one that's actually labelled first. So you can see, not too surprising at the top, the first thing that air goes through is your nasal passage. You could add in there nose and mouth if you wish. Obviously breathing occurs through both the nose and the mouth, and we'll look at what happens as air goes through those two locations in the next slides. Air passes through the nose and mouth, moves down to the throat, more technically known as the pharynx. So that takes up this whole area from the back of the nasal cavity here all the way down to the voice box. The voice box is the next part. That's called the larynx, obviously producing sound. It has another vital role that we'll talk about shortly. Air then passes down through the trachea, or windpipe, before branching into the bronchial tree. And you can see why they would call this the bronchial tree. If you turn it upside down, you've got the trunk, or trachea. You've got the major branches, or bronchial tubes, often shortened down to bronchi. You then have smaller branches, known as bronchioli. And then you have, finally, the leaves on the end of the trees, which are called the alveoli, which are the sites of gas exchange. So, unlike what most people actually think when asked about lungs, a lot of people would say, oh, they're just empty air sacs. You can see here that there's actually a huge variety of structures within the lungs, and the air simply perfuses into these little structures, and that's where the inflation occurs. At the bottom of the lungs here, you can see the muscle of breathing. It's known as the diaphragm. And then the last structure that's on this picture here is the pleura, which is the actual lining of the lung itself. So the epithelial layers of the lung, or skin type layers if you wish, that make up the lung itself. So let's have a look at each of those parts in a little bit more detail. But first, I guess just a general introduction of the structures and the actions of the lungs. So the term ventilation is what we say when we talk about breathing. So to ventilate is to get air in and to get air out of the lungs, and that's obviously the first steps in respiration. The next step is we need to exchange the gases. The key gases are oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air and in your blood. Get it into your blood, transport it off to the tissues that need that oxygen, and then exchange the gases again, dropping off oxygen to the tissues and picking up the waste product CO2. And this is what provides oxygen for cellular metabolism. So the first thing we need to realize is that every single cell of the human body needs a constant supply of oxygen to stay alive. And we provide that through the respiratory system. You're probably familiar with the basic steps of breathing, but we draw in oxygen-rich air through our airways. A general cleansing of that air occurs as it goes through the initial structures. We then exchange the gases with the blood, and hemoglobin is the main player in this process that picks up the oxygen from the lungs and transports it through the bloodstream. We then carry it off to the organs and the cells of the body, and then pick up any waste from those places and take it back to the lungs to expel that air that's now high in carbon dioxide. No surprises there. We can break up the physical components of the respiratory system into two divisions. The conducting division is simply tubes and passageways that air flows through on the way down to the deeper parts of our lungs. And then the respiratory division is from the alveoli to the blood, and then from the blood into the cells. So that's the stuff that happens internally. Another little video here, guys, that I'll get you to watch in your own time, but it just talks about breathing and the associated structures. But we're going to go through this now one at a time. So the first point of contact is obviously the nose and the mouth. There are several functions that these guys do, and most of them they do in a combined nature. First thing is they warm the ear. So the nasal passage is designed so that air makes a few rotations as it goes through, and that gives maximal coverage, I guess, of each air particle against the wall of the nasal lining. So 3 or 4 circular rotations inside the nasal passage ensures that air touches the walls, and in those walls are a bunch of blood vessels that sit very close to the surface, and warm blood inside those blood vessels helps to warm that air as it goes through. The other reason for getting it to touch the walls of the nasal passage a bunch of times is the nasal passage is lined with mucus and also has some hair cells lining there, and of course that any dust that's present in the air that comes through will have 3 or 4 goes at touching the wall and hopefully trap as many of those dust particles as possible, which cleans the air. The mucus nature of the inside lining of both the mouth and the nose ensures that the air is humidified a little, and that's important because as air warms it typically wants to rise, and we actually want it to go down into the deeper parts of our lungs, so a little humidity helps with that. It also keeps our nasal passage, our trachea and associated structures moist, which is important. We all know what it feels like when air dries out those areas. The fourth function is one for the nose only, and that is of course the detection of odours. Primarily designed to keep us from breathing in noxious gases, so we would know that we're breathing in something we shouldn't, but also some other nice additives of that as well, which is the smell of food, etc., which enhances taste. So once air has gone through the nasal cavity here and performed a couple of loops, sticking as much as it can against the walls in terms of debris and dust, it makes its way into the back of the nasal cavity here. Obviously if we're breathing through the mouth that would have come through, and many of the filtering functions of the nose can't happen in the mouth, so we rely on a secondary catchment point here at the back of the throat where there's a thick mucus lining, and this is the region of the pharynx. So the pharynx, better known as the throat, it's actually a muscular funnel divided into 3 regions that you can see here. Right at the back of the nose, or the nasal cavity, we've got then the connecting part between the mouth and the nasal cavity here, and then we have this lower portion here that links onto the larynx. So you have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx, a muscular funnel that has a couple of key roles. Firstly, we don't have the ability to trap as much dust through our mouth, and a lot of us do breathe through our mouth, particularly when exercising. So any debris or bugs or anything like that comes in, you'll find they get stuck in this mucus layer at the back down here. So also a thick mucus layer up here in the nasopharynx will stop anything that hasn't been picked up on its way through the nasal passage here. This is quite an annoying part. You can see that this is the narrowest part of the tube, and when we have inflammation in here in terms of a cold, or it may even be something like a bit of hay fever or something like that, then the swelling between these 2 components here will obviously narrow this right down, making the passage of both air and mucus a little bit difficult. It's a very hard place to shift stuff from as well, this area here, sort of caught between being able to cough something up and sniff something down. So any dust that makes its way through this part here or through the mouth will get trapped here, and you've got a choice at that point. Do you hoik it up, or do you swallow it down to the digestive tract? In the laryngopharynx, by the time it gets down to here, this is really where the swallowing part of the throat comes in. So this is the bit that we would feel hurts, I guess, when we tend to swallow, if it's inflamed. So pharyngitis is effectively a sore throat. So secondary role you can see in here is aids in swallowing. So the 2 functions of the pharynx are traps larger dust particles in the mucus that weren't able to be picked up by hairs or saliva, and then aids you in swallowing. Air then makes its way down further to probably the largest or widest part of the respiratory tract here. It's a cartilage box more affectionately known as the voice box, but its primary name is the larynx. And surprisingly, its main role is not the production of sound. That's very useful. The vocal cords are held within this structure here, and of course we have the vibration against the cartilage that causes the sound waves that we produce. But its main role is actually to keep food and drink out of your main airway, your trachea. And it does this through this little muscle here, known as the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is one of only a couple of muscles that is anchored only at one end and sits free at the other. And you can see it's like a little tongue, and it simply flops over the air tube, the windpipe, if food or fluid comes down, and it opens up when air comes through. And you may be familiar with the little dangly bit at the back of your throat, the uvula, and that acts as a little warning signal really when something solid comes through in the form of food or water and touches that. That's the indicator that tells the epiglottis to flap over the airways so that air can come. That food or water can pass through to the digestive system down the esophagus and knock down the airways. And it's a pretty nifty system. We muck around with it a lot. We talk and laugh and breathe and drink and eat all at the same time, and we very rarely choke, which shows how good it is at its job. So that's the larynx. From this point on, we're really talking about tubes that just deliver air in smaller and smaller doses down into the deeper parts of our lungs. It starts with the main trunk or trachea. You can see it's quite a wide tube that has cartilage rings disposed along its length, and the idea of that is we are creating a kind of suction, I guess, a vacuum when we breathe, and as we know, a vacuum can suck tubes together, and if that happened in this case, then this tube would suck together, and because of its mucus lining, it would stick together. So in order to stop that from happening, these cartilage rings keep the tube nice and open. So it's thought that this may be the origin of the vacuum cleaner pipe. You'll know that a vacuum cleaner pipe typically has rings of plastic along its length, and again the first examples of vacuum cleaners, they tried it with cloth or plastic type piping, and it's sucked together quite often, so these rings help keep the circular nature of it open so that air comes through. Its job is simply to deliver air down into the left and right lungs here, where it splits into the next things we look at, which is the primary bronchi. So the bronchial tree starts here. We've got the two main divides, the left and right primary bronchi, and their job is simply to deliver air into the left and right lungs respectively. Now they actually branch into smaller branches here called secondary and then finally tertiary bronchi, so just smaller and smaller tubes, and then finally they'll branch a number of times into the bronchioles, which are very small tubes that deliver air into the alveoli. The whole idea is that we almost get the oxygen molecules to line up in single file, if you like, so that we can get maximum contact with the blood cell as it comes in, and therefore transport as much of that oxygen as we can. So by the time we get to the smallest of the bronchioles, we're talking about 65,000 tiny little structures that are getting oxygen to line up. So at the end of each of the little bronchioli, we have these alveolar sacs, like little buds of grapes, if you like, and these alveoli bud from the wall of the bronchioles and are the sites for gas exchange, where capillaries from the pulmonary capillaries, which we learned about in the cardiovascular system, actually wrap around these, and we will see in the next picture coming up, you can see these little buds down here. So we've got at the end of the bronchioles these little, almost like little beehives stuck on the end here. The whole point was to get oxygen down to this point here so that it could then meet with the blood vessels. So what we're looking at here is the blue blood coming into the lungs to pick up more oxygen. So we're coming in via the pulmonary arteriole, would have come from the pulmonary artery out of the right side of the heart, branched into the pulmonary arterioles. Pulmonary arterioles come in, branch into the pulmonary capillaries, and you can see these don't end, they simply wrap around. They come in blue, they diffuse the CO2 into the alveoli, which then takes the CO2 back out of the lungs, and we breathe it out, and they diffuse in the oxygen, which makes the blood go red, and then you can see the red blood coming from the capillaries back into the pulmonary venules, and then they'll go back to the pulmonary veins and into the left side of the heart to transport to the rest of the body. So the lungs themselves are cone-shaped organs, wider and flatter at the bottom, and they actually rest on the diaphragm. So I'll take you back just for a look here. You can see cone-shaped at the top, wider and flatter at the bottom, and they actually rest on the diaphragm. So you can see the diaphragm is actually impeding them to some degree here. This is the diaphragm underneath here, this sort of dome-shaped muscle. It's actually pushing up and into them. It's preventing them from reaching their full capacity, which is really important as we go forward for breathing. The flat surfaces or costal surfaces, the ones that we would be looking at front on, are actually attached to the ribs. So they rest against the rib cage, they're attached to the rib cage, and that's also very important because if we move the rib cage, what that's going to do is actually expand the lung space. It's going to pull the walls of the lungs further apart and expand the walls of the lungs, and that's going to be a really important function of breathing that we'll talk about soon. Of course, they fill most of the rib cage, but actually we've got a few other structures under there as well. We've got the liver, the spleen, and the stomach sort of propping up at the bottom of the lung cage, getting a bit of protection from that as well. The left lung actually has only 2 lobes, while the right lung has 3 lobes. And we'll go back and look at this picture here, and you'll see that. So you've got the superior lobe and the inferior lobe, you've got the superior lobe, the inferior lobe, and then the middle lobe, they call it here, so 3. And the reason this one's able to have 3 and this one only has 2 is you can see there's large indentation here on the side. That's of course the heart, so the heart tilting off towards the left here, again impeding on the ability of the lungs to open up to their fullest there. So a smaller capacity, if you like, on this side than this side here, due to the heart's presence. So there's a little video up here that's worth a watch, guys. What it's got is a pair of human lungs, healthy ones. It shows how they inflate on the outside, what they should look like, and then a pair of smokers' lungs, which has a bit of lung disease in it as well, and just looking at the differences. I won't show you that now just for time, but please feel free to go under the Prezi and have a look at that video to get a sense of what our lungs look like when they inflate. Okay, so we've covered sort of the basic structures and what air does as it goes through to the lungs. The next most important step to think about is how does air actually come in and out of our lungs? And it sounds really simple, and in fact you're probably sitting there right now just saying, well, we suck it in and then we blow it out. But that's actually not quite true. We don't have any ability at all to suck air into our lungs, and anyone who's been winded realizes that sensation of trying to breathe in, but you physically can't, and I'll explain why soon. But air movement is not about sucking from A to B. Air movement is about manipulating the pressure between one of 2 places. So the basic rule of airflow is that air will always move to an area of lower pressure. So to put that in perspective, if you've got 2 areas and one has a high pressure in it and one has a lower pressure, then the air will always move from the area of high pressure to the area of low pressure. And we can use weather as an example of that. You'll remember if you've watched a weather program on the news, they often talk about highs and lows. And you see those H's sort of come up and then the L's come up in different parts. And what that does is dictate wind direction. If you've got a high over the Tasman coming from Australia and a low in New Zealand, then the direction of air is going to come from Australia to New Zealand, which is a warm nor'wester. But if we have a high over the Antarctic and then a low over New Zealand, then of course we're going to have a wind direction that's southerly, bringing cold air. So it's all to do with pressure differences. And this is exactly the same when we talk about the lungs. Okay, and the picture here, whoops, I'll just go back one, sorry. In the picture here, you can see at rest the intrapulmonary pressure, and that's the one we're interested in. The intra, within, pulmonary, within the lungs pressure, is 760 mmHg. And I can tell you that at sea level, air pressure outside is 760 mmHg. So on this thing here at rest, between breaths, there's no air moving in, there's no air moving out, because the pressure in the lungs is exactly the same as the pressure in the outside air. So the question is, how do we get air to come in when we want to take a breath in? And the answer is we need to decrease the pressure inside our lungs to lower than the outside atmospheric pressure. So in our inspiration picture here, you'll see that the pressure inside the lungs, the intrapulmonary pressure now, is 757. So it's less than the 760 outside by a count of -3. Now how have we achieved this? The moment we get this pressure lower than the outside air pressure, you'll see that air starts to flow into the lungs. Now, contrary to popular belief, your lungs don't inflate because air flows into them. Your lungs need to increase in size before air flows into them, and it will draw air in. So I want you to picture an example of an air bed. Let's say you've got a friend coming to stay, you roll out an air bed and you pump that sucker up, and you're pumping away, and you're checking the pressure of it, and it gets to a point where the pressure feels good, so you put the cap on. And you put the cap on, you've now got some good firm air pressure in that air bed. And when you look over, you see that your mate's actually lying or sitting on the end of the air bed. When they get off, think about what's going to happen to the pressure inside that air bed. So if your mate rolls off the end, where they were that was preventing air from filling that space, of course, has now been they've been removed from that area, and the air that's already inside the air bed would now make its way into that space that was vacated by your friend getting off. And as the air that moves out of the well-pressured area moves into the area that's now been vacated, what's going to happen to the total air pressure of that bed? And the answer, of course, is that it's going to go a bit flat, as the air that was in a nice tight space has now been able to move into a greater space. That air has been distributed throughout the air bed, and of course the pressure is now dropped. So exactly the same principle can be applied to the lungs. The airbed is your lungs, and the mate that's lying on the end of the airbed is the diaphragm right here. So the diaphragm is impeding the lungs from opening up to their potential here. And a nice quiet breath, all you need to do is get your mate to get off the airbed. In this case, the diaphragm will flex down, the lungs will open up with gravity to their sort of maximal capacity in terms of a resting state. The air that was already in these lungs now moves down into those vacated spaces, and the total pressure inside your lungs will drop below 760. The moment that happens, a vacuum is being created, and air will be forced in from the outside due to the rule of high to low air pressure movement. So air will now flow in to the lungs to try and achieve the same pressure as outside. So it's really a case of air being forced down your throat and into your lungs because you've reduced the pressure inside your lungs. Now air will flow in, of course, raising the pressure inside the airbed again as new air comes in, and when it reaches 760, then air will stop flowing in again. So what if we want to take a really deep breath in? The diaphragm flexes down as usual, but you'll remember I mentioned before that your ribs are also attached to your lungs. And when you take a deep breath, what do you notice about your rib cage? When you take a deep breath, your rib cage lifts and expands. And if the costal surfaces, the flat, wide surfaces of your lungs, these guys here, are attached to the ribs, that's going to pull the lungs apart. Okay, it's going to increase the size of the lung space, and therefore air pressure will drop even more. So the deeper the breath you want to take in, the lower you've got to get the air pressure inside those lungs. And the only way you can do that is to make the lungs much bigger than they were before, so that the existing air in there moves into those new spaces and creates a lower pressure than what was there before. And this will drive air in from the outside down your throat and fill up the lung cage. And again, we'll see that as an expanding rib cage. Really important to remember that the expansion actually occurs a fraction of a second before the air starts flowing in. Now once you've got that concept down in your head, you can actually start to understand the second part of breathing, which is expiration. So I just want you to note again, things to note here. First thing, at rest, pressure inside the lungs the same as outside air pressure, 760. If we want to breathe in, the diaphragm flexes down, opening up the lungs at the bottom, and the ribcage lifts up, expanding the lung space. And you can see that in this picture, the lungs are bigger than in this picture here. Bigger because we've opened them up, not because air has now flown in. Okay, we've opened them up first, and then the air comes to fill in that space. The larger we make them, the lower the pressure goes, and the more air rushes in. Airflow will continue to come in until the air pressure builds up to 760 again. Getting the air out again is quite simple. You can see it in the picture. The lungs have gotten smaller. If you take a bag of air and you squeeze it, the pressure inside the bag increases and the air wants to come out. Think of a balloon. If you squeeze it, the air pressure rises, it pops, and the air goes rushing out. Maybe a better example would be a whoopee cushion. You place pressure on the bag of air, it forces its way through the opening and escapes, making a sound, obviously, on the way out. So, how do we do this? Quite simply, look at the diaphragm. It comes up, it presses on the bag of air, okay, increasing the pressure, forcing the pressure up above atmospheric pressure, and air, of course, will flow out to try and equalize that pressure. If you want to breathe out more forcibly, you can also compress your rib cage. So we'll talk about some muscles there soon, but compressing the rib cage down will further impact on the bag of air, making the lungs even smaller, raise the pressure even higher, and air will flow out forcibly. So, exact opposites going on here. Over here, lungs get bigger, diaphragm flexes down, ribs lift up, pressure drops, air flows in. Over here, lungs get smaller, diaphragm comes up, ribs come down, pressure gets higher, air flows out. And in both cases, air will stop flowing in or flowing out once the pressure achieves 760 again. So this little video I've just passed by tells you all about that process and shows you it in action. Up here, just to test your thinking a wee bit, we've got at rest, atmospheric pressure, like I said, is 760. Intrapulmonic pressure is 760. And this is in a resting state. During inspiration, we see the lungs have now got bigger. You see the bottom of the lungs have flattened out because the diaphragm has moved down. The ribs have expanded, and that means more space for air to move into. And of course, you can see the different lobes of the lungs have opened up quite significantly here. Okay, that causes air to rush in from the now higher atmospheric pressure. To force the air out again, you'll see that the diaphragm has come back up, impeding on the lungs. The ribs have come back in. It's forced the lungs smaller, raised the pressure inside, and the air now flows out to the outside atmosphere. So, these couple of slides just say what we've just talked about, but in words. If you increase your lung volume, it reduces your pressure inside the lungs, and a decrease in lung volume increases the pressure inside. Obviously, to get air in, we need to lower the pressure inside, and to get air out, we need to raise the pressure inside. Some of the muscles that we use to achieve these aims, we've already talked about the diaphragm, and in normal quiet breathing, that's really all you need. If you're just sitting there, your diaphragm flicks down, your diaphragm flicks up, and that's enough to get a normal breath in and a normal breath out. You might utilize your abs. If you try to forcibly blow, like trying to blow a pen off a table, for example, you'll feel that your abs engage. Now those abs engage and they press up the diaphragm rope goes up further, thus squishing the lungs more, and air flows out more forcibly. The scalenes are a couple of muscles that are found in your neck. I'll just take you to them now. So the scalenes, you'll find that are these neck muscles that you see here. And the neck muscles, their job is to anchor the first rib. We might even see one on the front page here, so let's go back. We can't see them on here, but they're not labelled, but they are here. These muscles here that come down and anchor the first rib in place. And that's quite important because the rib cage is typically going to lift up and out. And if it doesn't have something to anchor against, then conceivably this rib cage could end up under your chin and whack into your chin. So when you breathe in deeply, you'll find that your scalenes lock on that first rib and stop it from migrating north. The other key muscles are the intercostal muscles. And you'll see them written here, the internal intercostal muscles, which is probably from nipple line through to sternum there. So they would cause a pigeon chest situation to occur. So the internal intercostals, if they were to recruit, would cave in your chest, and that would of course squish your lungs and make pressure rise. So they'd be used during expiration. Whereas the external intercostals run from about the nipple line all the way back to the back of your spine. And when they recruit, they're going to lift and spread apart your rib cage, which is going to be useful for pulling your lungs wider apart and therefore aiding inspiration. So they're the guys that you're going to use. And if you've ever hurt your ribs before and bruised those muscles, you'll know all about it. Every time you breathe in, there's a pain associated with that as they work those bruised ribs. And there are a bunch of other muscles that we can use there as well. Your traps, if you get hit on the back in the middle traps, it often makes you expel air quickly. Okay, so also things like the pecs and the lats, if you squish down, if you're trying to blow out 50 candles or something like that, you'll find that your shoulders roll forward and try to squish those lungs as small as they can. And similarly, if you use your posterior delts and your middle traps to pull your shoulders back, you can get more air in your lungs. So, a rhythmic change in pressure. This is probably the key slides, I guess, to remember the process, okay? A rhythmic change in pressure, the diaphragm drops, increasing your thoracic cavity or lung space, and the scalenes fix your first ribs in place. The external intercostals then lift up your ribs, and all of these actions lead to an increase in your lung space, which reduces the pressure in your lungs, and air will now flow in from the higher atmospheric pressure. If you want to breathe deeply, you're going to need to recruit more muscles to help you further expand. We've talked about how things like the middle back, posterior delt, and some others here, the erector spinae, would get you to lean back just to try and really open up that thoracic cavity. In expiration, it's actually not a taxing part of breathing. The most taxing part of breathing is definitely breathing in. Okay, but breathing out is simply a relaxation. You've already done the hard work, you've moved the muscles. Now if you relax them, they'll return to their resting places and air will flow out. So it doesn't really require any muscle action in normal quiet breath. We've got elastic lungs which have expanded. They want to go back to normal. And of course, you're going to relax your diaphragm, which is going to come back up, and you're going to relax your intercostals, which is going to drop your rib cage with gravity. So that's an easy phase where you just relax things. The lungs get squished smaller and the air rushes out to the now lower atmospheric pressure as the squishing of those lungs has caused the pressure to rise. Forced expiration, a little bit different. Okay, you do use muscles. So that's where we recruit our internal costal muscles or intercostal muscles to drive in our rib cage. We use our abs to drive up the diaphragm further, and that's going to squish the lungs a lot further closed, and therefore air will flow out or rush out quickly because of the higher pressure we've achieved inside. So there's one other governing factor around air flow and air perfusion, and that is the warmth of the air and the importance of temperature. You've all, I'm sure, experienced a time where you've had to exercise in cold conditions, and if you haven't had an effective warm-up, you'll know that when you leave the house middle of winter, go for your run, it's quite hard to get your breathing going. You'll always be a little bit short of breath and not really expanding your lungs to their fullest. You'll even feel that cold air reaching the inside of your lungs. So Charles' law states that the warmer the air is, the more it helps to inflate the lungs, and that's why a warm-up is so vitally important. If you've got a cold day, you need to warm up, because warming up warms your blood, and blood goes everywhere, including into your nasal passages, the linings of your pharynx, larynx, trachea, etc. And what's going to happen is the warmer you can get your blood, the more effectively you're going to be able to warm the air as it comes through those tubes, and that's going to enable your lungs to open up to their full potential. So you'll get to the bottom of those lobes, and you'll be able to expand those lungs better, getting more air in per breath. So warmth is important, and that means the warm-up is absolutely vital, particularly on cooler days. Alright, so at this point, we've got to the point where oxygen-rich air has been breathed in through your mouth or nose. It's been warmed, humidified, and we've trapped some foreign particles. It's then moved down through the pharynx, where we've trapped a few more things, into the larynx and the trachea, and it's finally entered the primary and secondary and tertiary bronchi, through the bronchioles, and down to the alveoli. It's a time now to look at how the exchange of gases occurs. So gas exchange actually works the same as air exchange. And we know the rule of airflow. The rule of airflow is that air always moves from high pressure to low pressure. Now I want you to use that exact same philosophy when we talk about gases exchanging. The two key gases we're interested in are oxygen and carbon dioxide. We derive oxygen from the air outside, and we produce carbon dioxide inside our cells that needs to get taken out of our body. I want you to imagine for a second that you have a jar, and in that jar there's a divider in the middle, so a removable divider. we're going to pump in pure oxygen to the top half of the jar and put the lid on, and we're going to pump in pure CO2 to the bottom half of the jar. Okay, so you have pure CO2 at the bottom, pure oxygen at the top, and a dividing layer in the middle. When I remove the dividing layer, let's think what might happen. We have a large concentration of oxygen at the top and a large concentration of CO2 at the bottom. So we would say that the pressure of the oxygen, because there's lots of oxygen at the top, is high, and we would say that the pressure of the CO2 down the bottom is high, because there's lots of CO2 molecules. Now what do we know about pressure? If one area has a high pressure of something and the other has a low pressure of something, you're going to see gases diffuse from high to low. So what would happen in the case of this jar when we remove the divider is that CO2 would migrate north and oxygen would migrate south until an even mix existed of oxygen and CO2 on both sides of the jar. So the jar would effectively be full of an even displacement of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay, so it's not only total air pressure that's important here, that's important for breathing, but when we get inside it's more important about the partial pressure of the gases that we're talking about here. Now I want you to keep that jar scenario fresh in your head, because the jar scenario with the divider can be used to exactly replicate what happens at the points of diffusion in the human body. So we know that air moves to a lower pressure from high to low. The same is also true of gases. They move from high pressure to low pressure. Now what makes a pressure of a gas? Having lots of it. If there is lots of oxygen in one place, we would call that a high pressure of oxygen. And that's represented by a term called PO2, the partial pressure of oxygen, or the pressure of oxygen. That number will be higher the more oxygen there is in a place, and lower where there's less oxygen in a place. The same is true of CO2. We could call it the PCO2. If there's lots of CO2 present somewhere, it would have a high PCO2, and if there's not much CO2 present, there would be a low PCO2. Now we know that air is not all oxygen. You may not be familiar with the exact numbers, but I'll show them to you here. About 79% of the air is nitrogen, which is a useless gas for us effectively. We don't absorb it into our body through air. So about 79% of the air is a useless gas for us. About 21% of the air is oxygen. That's what we want. And a very, very small percentage of air is CO2. Now we know what happens with trees. Trees take in our CO2 and they give off oxygen. And the exact same thing happens in our bronchial tree inside. If you think about it, the bronchial tree, the alveoli, take CO2 from the blood and deliver oxygen into the blood. So it's like an inverted tree that's doing the same job. Now if we know that the total air pressure is 760 and we know that 21% of that is oxygen, we can actually work out what the percentage of oxygen is in terms of a pressure component. So 21% of the total air pressure would be oxygen pressure. And in this case, if we take 21%, times it by the total air pressure, we find out the amount of pressure that oxygen is responsible for is 159 millimoles of mercury. Now we don't have to worry too much about numbers. All we need to know is that that's as high as it gets in natural terms on Earth. Sea level, 21% oxygen, 159 millimoles of mercury. Okay, so anywhere inside our body is going to have a less pressure of oxygen than that. So if we can get this high oxygen air into our body, there's a good chance that our body's going to take it because it would have less. And we always know that oxygen moves from high to low. Just remember, the pressure of oxygen represents how much oxygen is present. So we can just talk about it as an amount rather than a pressure. We can just say there's lots of oxygen. Now there's 2 points of diffusion you guys need to be familiar with. Alright? The first point of diffusion is between the lungs and the blood. So from the alveoli we put the oxygen into the blood so we can carry it off to the tissues. And then the second point of diffusion is where we exchange the oxygen from the blood to the tissues to keep the tissues alive. And we're going to focus on oxygen. If we can understand how oxygen works, we can then apply it to CO2 later. Alright, so herein lies what looks like a pretty tricky diagram. But it's actually exactly the same diagram that we looked at in the cardiovascular system. Okay, so in that diagram we had the lungs, the pulmonary circuit up the top, and down the bottom we had the body cells. In the middle we had the heart with its atriums and ventricles there. And all we've done is take the heart out of the middle and put them off to the sides here, so it's like a circuit, right? So just to explain, here's the body, and here's the blood coming back from the body through the right side of the heart and out to the lungs. Here's the blood arriving at the lungs and the pulmonary arteries. Here's the pulmonary capillaries meeting with the alveoli inside the lungs. And then here's the blood leaving the lungs, would go back through the left atrium, left ventricle, and get pumped out to the body through the systemic arteries. And here it is reaching the body cells. And let's call this muscle and lungs. Muscle down the bottom, lungs at the top. And here are our 2 points of diffusion. You can see CO2 and oxygen being exchanged at the lungs to blood, and then CO2 and oxygen being exchanged from the blood into the tissues. Alright, now this is not going to surprise you. Look, this is blue blood. We know what blue blood is. Blue blood means low oxygen levels. So the pressure of oxygen in this blood going back would be low because, of course, low oxygen means low pressure of oxygen. And then you can see it's represented by a number here, 40. PO2 equals 40. Now remember, outside it was 159, which would be considered really high. So 40 is a much lower number than 159. That's because there is much less oxygen in the blood coming back to the lungs. Why is there low oxygen in the blood coming back to the lungs? Because the body cells have utilized some of that oxygen. So we've taken the oxygen, and this is just whatever wasn't used coming back now. Check out inside the alveoli, a PO2 of 105. That's considered really high inside the body. But we have to pause for a second and think, well, what happened to the 159? 159 was sucked in the outside air and came down through the bronchi, through the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and got down into the alveoli, and suddenly it's only 105? Did we lose a third of the oxygen on the way down? The answer is no, we didn't lose any oxygen on the way down, because we never fully deflate our lungs. There is always air, residual volume within our lungs, and that air is typically full of nitrogen or carbon dioxide, so kind of dead air that just keeps our lungs inflated. Okay, so when the new fresh air comes in, it mixes with this residual volume, and that shows a relatively lower amount of oxygen as a mixture. But we haven't lost any of the molecules. It's just represented by a slightly lower number as it's mixed with other gases. So 100 would be considered really high levels of oxygen. After a fresh breath in our alveoli, we've got 100. So what happens when low oxygen blood in the capillaries touches high oxygen alveoli? We know the rule. Gases diffuse from high to low pressure. Here we have 105 high meeting 40 low, so oxygen will jump across. It'll be driven across due to the pressure difference, and it'll drive it into the blood cells until the levels of oxygen are virtually equal. So you can see when the blood leaves the lungs, it now has a PO2 of 100, virtually equal to what was inside the lungs. Remember, there's always going to be more oxygen left in here that we didn't take. But 100 leaves, you would say this is blood fully saturated in oxygen. Call it 100% full if you want. 100% of the oxygen we can carry, we're now carrying. And that oxygen-rich blood now moves its way out to the body tissues. When it arrives at the tissues, you see here, PO2 of 100, meaning we haven't lost any, loads of fresh oxygen arriving at the tissues. In order for this oxygen to dump into the muscle cells or body cells, we know there has to be a pressure difference. So that means there must be less oxygen in the body cells than in the blood arriving. And that would be the case, of course, because the body cells are always going to be using some of the oxygen. So as soon as oxygen is dumped in, we utilize some of it, and then, of course, the rest gets taken back to the lungs. So when 100 arrives in the capillaries, lots of oxygen, it touches body cells that have less oxygen in it, and that will drive the oxygen molecules into the body cells because of the pressure difference from high to low. Now, when will the exchange stop? When will the alveoli stop exchanging with the blood? And when will the blood stop exchanging with the body cells? And the answer, of course, is when the two pressures are even again. So, we will always top up to 100 up the top here at the alveoli and blood. And down the bottom, that number will differ depending on how much activity we're doing. Because if we're not doing much and sitting there just watching TV, of course we don't need a lot of the oxygen. So we just take what we need. The muscle cells aren't using a lot, so they already have quite significant levels of oxygen within them, and therefore we just drop off the additional oxygen that we need at the rate that we're using it. But if we're doing a lot of activity with our muscles, we might be using a load of the oxygen that's coming to us, and therefore the baseline inside the body cells would be much lower, causing more oxygen to dump in. Then if more oxygen dumps in, then of course less oxygen goes back to the lungs, creating a bigger difference between the 105 and the alveoli and whatever is present in our bloodstream. So to illustrate that point, I'll show you right now. I can tell you now that in the body cells there is a PO2 of 40 in this picture here, and I know that because there's a PO2 of 40 leaving in the blood going back to the lungs. And we know that exchange occurs until the two areas are even. So if there's 40 out here, there must have been 40 in here before that blood moved on. 100 has arrived, we've dumped in 60, so 60% of the oxygen, and we've taken 40 back because we haven't used that, we haven't needed it. And that tells us that the body cells are utilizing 60% of the available oxygen coming out. Now if this picture represented someone who was power walking, and they were using 60% of the available oxygen, I want you to think about this. What would happen if I got that person power walking to start running at a faster intensity? What would happen to the number over here? Would it raise or would it lower? Would there be more or less oxygen making its way back to the lungs? The answer is there would be less oxygen, so this number would lower. The reason why? The body cells would use more of the available oxygen. Let's say they started using 80% of the oxygen that was within them. 100 would arrive, 80 would jump in, and that would leave only 20 and change going back. 20 would go back to the lungs where it meets 100, causing 80 to dump in to top it up to 100 again, and away we go. If the muscles were using all of the available oxygen, the level of oxygen in the cells would be 0, and 100% of the oxygen from the blood would jump in, leaving none in the blood going back to the lungs. And of course when 0 arrived up here, 100 would pour in very quickly because of the change in difference in pressure. Okay, so it's all pressure orientated, and pressure is derived from how much of a given gas there is. Now, it's worth asking the question, can we raise the amount that we can carry in this blood? Because that could have benefits, obviously, to an athlete. What if we could make this higher than 100? Now, the only way we could do that is by increasing our carrying capacity in our blood. The part of our blood that carries oxygen is known as hemoglobin. And there's a little video on the next slide that I urge you to watch that shows hemoglobin's role. But effectively, we know red blood cells carry oxygen. Each red blood cell has around 250 million hemoglobin molecules. Each one of those hemoglobin molecules has 4 components of iron attached to them. And the iron is what the oxygen binds to. So you have 250 million hemoglobin molecules, each carrying 4 molecules of oxygen. And that's one red blood cell. And then think of all the blood cells you have in your body. So the way in which we could carry more oxygen would be to increase our levels of hemoglobin or red blood cells. And we can do that a number of ways. Exercising, doing challenging cardiovascular exercise will raise our levels of red blood cells in response. Secondarily, we could go to altitude and make our body fight for the oxygen that it has to get into its system. And if that was the case, then your body would go, oh, I obviously don't have enough carrying capacity here because I'm not receiving enough oxygen, and therefore would start to grow more red blood cells in response to that, which later, when you came back from altitude, would make it easier for you to carry oxygen at sea level. Now, we're talking about altitude for a moment because people have a misconception of that as well. There is no less oxygen at altitude. People say the air is thinner, which they presume it means it has less oxygen, but the oxygen levels are the same. The difference is the pressure is much lower. So at Mount Everest Base Camp, for example, the outside air pressure is about 540 mmHg as opposed to 760. And if you think about it, what did your lungs have to do to get air to come in? They had to lower the pressure in your lungs below the 760 to get air to come in. Imagine how much they have to work to expand your ribcage to lower the air pressure inside your lungs to below 540. That would mean you would have to take a maximal type breath just to get any air to want to come in to your lungs. And therefore that's going to limit the amount of air that you can bring into your lungs and limit the amount of oxygen that goes into your bloodstream. And that's going to cause your body to think, well, hang on, it must be me. I can't get enough oxygen. It doesn't think about the environment. It just thinks that I'm not getting enough oxygen. So it starts the process of developing more blood cells, and therefore you reap the benefit of that. Alright, so we'll just recap using the notes here briefly, team. And then that sort of wraps up this. We'll look at a couple of measures of the respiratory system, but first, just looking at this is the words of the picture we just looked at. So PO2, I'm going to change the word PO2 to amount of oxygen. The amount of oxygen in the blood entering the lungs is low. The amount of oxygen in your lungs is high. So oxygen comes out of your lungs and into your blood due to the rule of gas exchange. It then gets carried through your system by hemoglobin, and when it reaches the tissues or the cells, the oxygen levels in the blood that's reaching your muscles is high. But the oxygen levels in your muscles are lower because the muscles are using some of that oxygen. This causes oxygen to pour out of the blood and into the muscle cells due to the rule of gas flow. Now, exactly the same is true of CO2. I'm just going to go back to the picture real quick. I don't want to dwell on CO2 too much, but you can see it's exactly the same principle in opposite. Blood coming back from the body would be considered high in CO2 because we're producing it in the body cells. The more work you're doing, the higher the level of CO2 will be. Now, this low level activity, you can see PCO2 is 46. That's actually considered high. 46 up here, high. And in the lungs, 40, low. So because 46 meets 40, you're going to see CO2 jump out. Now, because we're not working out super hard, we're not producing large amounts of CO2, but this number will rise dramatically as we start to do more activity. And of course, the more that arrives back to the capillaries and the lungs, the more that's going to dump into our blood, into our lungs, and the more we're going to breathe out. Now, quite even amounts of oxygen and CO2 are actually being exchanged here, and the reason for that is CO2 molecules are tiny in comparison to oxygen ones. They don't need as much pressure to drive them across, so quite a lot of CO2 is being exchanged here, even though the number difference isn't so big as 105 to 40. We're only talking about 46 to 40, but a good amount of CO2 is being poured out into the lungs and therefore breathed out. So you can see now that low CO2 makes its way out in the blood, arrives at the tissues, and of course the CO2 levels in the cells will be higher than that because it's producing it, and that will dump the CO2 in to take it back. So exactly the same principle as you can see there. Levels of CO2 in the blood reaching the tissues are low. Levels of CO2 in the tissues, the muscles, are high. Therefore CO2 comes out of the tissues into the blood and is carried back. And we'll talk about how that happens in a moment. Levels of CO2 in the blood entering the lungs is high because it's come from the body, and the lungs have low levels of CO2 because they continuously breathe it out. So CO2 dumps into the lungs to get rid of it. Alright, so if we're looking at this picture here, just as a recap, PO2 levels, oxygen levels in this blood, low. Oxygen levels inside the alveoli, high. Oxygen levels in the blood leaving the lungs, high. Oxygen levels in the blood reaching the muscles, high. Oxygen levels inside the muscles, low, because it's constantly using the oxygen. And oxygen levels in the blood going back to the lungs, low, because it's the change remaining from what we used here. And a good way to think about it might be shopping. Imagine this is an ATM that always tops you up to $100. You go out and you do your shopping, you spend whatever you need, and then you have the change in your pocket, you go back to the ATM and it tops you up to 100 every time. And the only way to get more money is to increase your levels of carrying capacity, the size of your wallet, if you like. And we talked about legal ways of doing that. Of course, I could have mentioned blood doping and those kind of things as well. There are illegal measures you can use to try and ramp up your red blood cell numbers as well, but nothing we want to do. As mentioned, hemoglobin is what carries the oxygen. About 98.5% of oxygen is carried by hemoglobin. The other 1.5 just doesn't quite make it on before the blood leaves, and it just floats along in the blood plasma. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules, and unfortunately for females, males typically carry more oxygen per litre of blood. Probably or likely to be a function of the fact that females menstruate and lose blood cells on a monthly basis, whereas males don't. Once it gets to the muscle, hemoglobin passes off oxygen to myoglobin, which loves oxygen just that little bit more, has a greater affinity, and therefore we can store a little bit of oxygen in our muscle fibers as well, particularly in our slow twitch fibers. which is good because it means it's there to be used straight away as opposed to waiting for it to circulate when we need it. It doesn't take long for hemoglobin to fully saturate with oxygen. You would have seen in that video before if you watched it that the oxygen jumps in pretty quickly, about 0.3 seconds. So that's not a limiting factor. Even when your heart's beating fast, there's still plenty of time for oxygen to jump onto hemoglobin. Just quickly on CO2. CO2 is not viewed as a good thing by the body. So it's a waste product, and the reason why it's a waste product is it's quite acidic in large numbers. So what happens is when CO2 pours out into the bloodstream, 20% of it jumps straight back on the hemoglobin molecule that brought the oxygen. 10% of it jumps straight into the plasma, so there's 30% just jumping straight out as CO2. But then we can't have large amounts of CO2 dumping in there because it's too acidic. So we actually buffer it at this point. It reacts with the water that comes out as a waste product, and it's changed to bicarbonate, which is sort of a harmless alkaline solution. And that's the way it's transported back to the lungs before it's all packaged back together, turned into CO2. And that's an important process. If we look at the equation down here, there's three waste products basically of aerobic metabolism. One's CO2, then you've got water, and then you've got heat. And if we take this CO2 and H2O, if you know some basic chemical equations here, CO2, H2O becomes H2CO3. So we've got two hydrogens and three oxygen molecules effectively here, and one carbon. Now that's called carbonic acid. So we don't want that. We don't want acid around our muscle and our bloodstream. It's going to cause burning. And so what we do is we buffer that into something called HCO3. So we drop a hydrogen ion effectively, and that becomes harmless bicarbonate. And that's fine at low levels, all right? But it's this guy over here, this little hydrogen ion, that if it causes accumulation of this when we do heavy exercise and we can't transport enough CO2 away, we don't have enough blood to keep carrying it away, then these guys accumulate and they can mix with another negatively charged ion called chloride that's there, making hydrochloric acid, which would effectively be lactic acid to you or me. And that's burning, and that shuts down a muscle quick. So here you see from the cell, CO2 jumping out, 20% going back into the red blood cell, 10% into the plasma, and then the vast majority, 70%, going into this equation here where it's carried as bicarbonate, a harmless substance, back to the lungs to breathe out. When it gets to the lungs, it all packages it back together as CO2 and we breathe it out. So the limiting factor, and we talked about this in the cardiovascular system for lactic acid, is the fact that you don't have enough blood arriving to take away the waste product. So the waste product accumulates within the muscle, and those hydrogen ions we see there can turn into lactic acid if we can't buff them quickly enough. And of course the muscle shuts down and game over. So the best way in order to deal with that is of course to strengthen your heart. We've talked about how you can get more blood to the muscle, which means you can keep clearing the CO2 at the rate that it's produced, and you'll avoid that onset of lactic acid. Okay, there's the wee video that talks about the hemoglobin, etc., and you're welcome to have a look at it. Okay guys, I realise it's a long lecture. We're just going to crack on and finish this off. A couple of effects of exercise just to finish, and how we measure the respiratory system. So just like we had cardiac output and heart rate and stroke volume for cardiovascular system as measures, we have these normal measures for ventilation too. Tidal volume is your normal breath in and out. It's usually about 500 mils coming in and 500 mils going out at normal quiet breathing. After you've taken a normal breath in, you can then fit approximately 3,000 mils or 3 extra litres into your lungs if you were to breathe in deeply after that initial breath in. And after a breath out, you can then force about another 1,200 mils out of your lungs as well. It's called your respiratory reserve volume. Why can't you blow more than that out, even though you've got far more potential to breathe in? Because we must always keep some air in our lungs. This 1,200 mils of air, so around a pint in each lung, is there to keep our lungs inflated and stop them from sticking together. So because we can fit all of this air in, our biggest breath in followed by our biggest breath out would yield around 4.5 litres of air into a bag. We can't go beyond that because of course we've got the residual volume that has to stay there. But if we add those two together, that means the total capacity of our lungs is about 6 litres. Okay. Now that can obviously be expanded as well with training. If you strengthen the muscles of your respiratory system, the intercostals, the diaphragm, etc., through rigorous training, then of course your lungs become more elastic, your breathing muscles become stronger, your rib cage can expand more, and you fit more air total into your lungs. And if you combine that with more red blood cells, then of course you're going to have a more efficient system with less breaths required per minute. So we usually measure this with a gas mask effectively. Okay, so ventilation is usually measured in a VO2 max situation or that kind of thing, where you can put on a gas mask and capture the air that comes out. And what we know is that during exercise, ventilation increases immediately as soon as you start doing more, just like heart rate does, and then levels off when you settle in at submaximal intensities. And that's an indication, again, that you're delivering and removing the exact amounts you need to maintain that exercise level. But when you go into an increasing exercise intensity type workout, where you increase the level of intensity, let's say every minute, whereas heart rate went up linearly to max, in this case breathing rate comes up linearly, but far before max, it'll actually go up really steeply. And this is an indicator that indicates that you're moving from aerobic to anaerobic performance or fuel systems. And what we know is that when we start to go anaerobic, there's much more CO2 starting to be produced because of the fuel that we're predominantly using being carbohydrate, and then that needs to be offloaded. So the onus then on the respiratory system is one, less of breathing in and getting oxygen to the muscle, but more breathing out and getting rid of that CO2 before it accumulates into lactic acid. This is called your ventilatory break point, and is essentially where your breathing gets a bit ragged during exercise. So constant load, submaximal exercise, your ventilation rate will go up initially and then plateau. When you're in hot and humid weather, it'll keep rising as dehydration starts to play a part, and you have less blood effectively to carry away the waste. But it's that incremental exercise where you'll see it go up to a point, and then when you hit your ventilatory break point, that anaerobic, aerobic sort of threshold, you'll see it shoot up and your breathing will become ragged. So you would have seen this before. If you've ever run on a treadmill and you've been running away relatively comfortable and you think, oh, I'll put it up a little, and you put it up a little and you're fine, and then you put it up another one, but your breathing starts to get a bit ragged, you know that you've just reached that level where the focus becomes on breathing out, panting, rather than breathing in. And that's an indication that your body's now producing large amounts of CO2 and needs to focus on offloading that. It's also an indication that you've got about 90 seconds left of running at that pace before you start to tie up, because that's really the anaerobic sort of threshold, is that sort of 90 second to 2 minute marker. Now you'll see down here that rise occurs somewhere between 50 and 70% in most people. Fitness is the factor there, guys. So that could happen much earlier in unfit people, where they start to get ragged, and the fitter you get, the more you're able to withstand or offset that point further along the scale, so you can work harder before you hit that lactate threshold. Obviously, as we exercise, we breathe in deeper and breathe out more. So our tidal volume increases, and that obviously reduces our ability to breathe in more if we needed to, or breathe out more if we needed to. And you'll notice that when you finish a hard workout, it's very hard to get your breath under control initially. Total lung capacity in one workout remains unchanged, but of course over time, as I mentioned before, you can increase that. So here's an example of that rising intensity breathing rate. So this is someone doing a VO2 max test. You can see at the low levels, they're sort of plateaued here, and they're rising, but it's rising very slowly as they go up the intensity chain. And then it sort of hits this point here, and you see it starts to rise sharply. So around this high 70 marker for this person here, they hit that ventilatory break point, and you can see that things went north pretty quickly after that. Okay, so the thing for them, why do this and why recognize where this happens? This is your ideal training point. So if you're doing your cardio, you really want to train right at this point, just prior to that exponential rise starting to occur here. Okay, that's really important, because that means you're going to challenge your cardiorespiratory system at the maximum of your aerobic powers before you go anaerobic, and that's where the real benefit is going to come. If you're just dawdling along down here, there's not going to be enough stimulus for your cardiovascular system to really improve. So we find that point where the breathing goes a little ragged, pull back slightly and just sit there at that level. And of course you're going to have to retest that regularly, because of course as your fitness improves, that break point is going to move along the line. Like I said, if this was a really unfit person having a test, that could have started rising up from about the 50 to 60 point right here, and of course they'd peak out a lot sooner in the effort stakes there. Okay, so what we want to do is push that as far to the right as we can, so we stay aerobic for as long as possible. So why does breathing rate increase when we exercise? It's pretty simple really, the same as heart rate. It's in order to deliver the oxygen we need and remove the carbon dioxide. Okay, so muscles require that increased oxygen need when they're working harder, and they require the removal of the CO2. And if I had to tell you two things to look out for, one is the deeper you breathe, then generally the more your body is interested in oxygen. It wants that oxygen in. It means that CO2 isn't a major factor yet, so you breathe nice and deeply. But the shallower you breathe and the more you breathe out, then the more the body is focused on offloading CO2, and that's the one that really affects your ventilation rates. Heart rate increases to match gas and nutrient delivery needs and take waste away from the muscles, and of course we need the oxygen to provide the blood system with as well, so we need to increase our breathing rate accordingly. Hyperventilation, if you're wondering, is an excess of what's required by the body. So basically that's you breathing out more than your body needs to because of an anxious response or a sympathetic adrenaline type response. And what happens if you're breathing out fast like that, you're offloading CO2 at a faster rate than is required by the body. Unfortunately, what that does is it alters your acid-base balance in your body. It can have really negative effects, particularly on your brain and other organs. So if you do that, one of the fixes you'll remember is you breathe into a bag, and the idea of that is you would recirculate the CO2, so you wouldn't just lose it, you'd breathe it back in again, and you'd be able to balance out that acid-base balance in your body. Okay, so trying to regulate your breathing is quite important during exercise as well, so you don't offload too much CO2 in the early stages. In the early stages aerobically, you want to make sure your breathing is quite measured and has a good flow to it in and out. How quickly can people improve? Well, pretty quickly. This was a trial done on a bunch of people that were just doing some general training. So obviously they're on a bike here, producing watts. So this is effort down the bottom here. Okay, and in their pre-test, you can see that they were taking about 40, just under 45, all the way up to about 80 breaths per minute. And you can see after about 6 weeks training, where they did some aerobic-based training, they were able to bring those breathing rates all the way down. So here we're saving about 20 breaths a minute, which shows how much more efficient their system has got. Now if you think of that, think about hard work that you do in the gym, etc., how quickly you could recover, because what do? We don't feel ready to go when our breathing's really puffy and really, really high. So imagine how much better you would be if you didn't achieve those sort of high levels there, or you're able to recover really, really quickly in terms of your breathing rate. You'd be ready to go again sooner. So it's an indication of both cardiovascular and respiratory system improvements. Why has it happened? Well, this is what's happened. Number one, because you've been doing this training, your lungs are more elastic, your breathing muscles are stronger, and you can now fit more air in and out of your lungs in one breath. And if you can do that, that means there's more oxygen available to dump into the larger numbers of red blood cells you now have. So an increase in pulmonary diffusion occurs because you've got more blood cells that are able to pick up that oxygen. Okay, and this last one, increase in A to VO2 diff, is arterial to venous oxygen difference. It just means that you're carrying far more oxygen per litre of blood, and therefore you've got more blood in your system, which means your body doesn't feel the need to increase your breathing and heart rates as much because it has a significant amount of oxygen transporting around it already. So you've just become a hell of a lot more efficient, and your heart and your breathing rate can slow down accordingly. So therefore, ventilation should be lower at any work rate after you've done a sustained period of training. It should feel easier, not just your heart rate, but your breathing rate. It'll also be due to the fact that you don't build up those dangerous hydrogen ions and turn them into lactic acid, because you have more blood that can clear the system quickly. And that means there's less feedback to stimulate that faster breathing, and therefore you can settle into your exercise. Even at higher intensities, you can settle in and do it aerobically. Alright team, sorry about the length of that one. It is the last one of the series, so AMP is effectively done after this one. We'll be filling in our little booklets, obviously in class, but hopefully that's answered a few questions for you, and we'll get ready now to study up for our cardiovascular respiratory system end of topic quiz. Anatomy done. Craig's out. See ya.